Hello. This marine ecology lecture is about coral reef ecosystems. I'm recording this for my marine ecology class at Florida Gulf Coast University, but of course anybody who's interested in coral reefs is welcome to watch it and hopefully learn from it. The picture that I'm showing on this cover slide here is an underwater scene from Moorea, French Polynesia. So this is near Tahiti in the Pacific Ocean. And what you see here is a living reef where there's almost 100% live coral cover. The entire surface of the reef is covered by these beautiful living organisms, a variety of species of stony corals, which provide a habitat for fishes and other organisms that thrive in reef environments. So before we get too far into the details of coral reefs, we should define what a reef is. And what a reef is kind of depends on who you ask. If you ask a sailor, a reef is a dangerous shallow spot where the ship might run aground and a hole be gouged in the hull by the dangerous shallows. So it doesn't really matter what the reef is made of in this case. It could be rocks or a sandbar or a shipwreck even. Anything that's sort of a dangerous shallow spot is a reef. And this is sort of how people thought of reefs in the old days. When the scientists began exploring reefs with the invention of scuba and submarines and other exploration technologies, we realized that there was incredible diversity on reefs and that they weren't just made of rocks, that they were what we call a biogenic rocky structure, where this rocky foundation that creates the reef is actually made from the shells or skeletons of living organisms. It's made of calcium carbonate, which is also known as limestone. That's the mineral that these living organisms lay down as they grow. And over years, centuries, millennia, this deposition of calcium carbonate creates this massive structure that's really a geological feature, just like mountains or big geological features on land, except that it's entirely made of the skeletal remains of these living organisms. I actually have in my office a piece of limestone rock that is a coral skeleton. This was dug from a quarry in Florida. The peninsula of Florida is made of limestone laid down by ancient reefs as the sea level has gone up and down over the past several 100,000 years. This is a species of coral called Dichoscenia stokesi. It's the elliptical star coral. It's a species that's still alive today, but this fossil coral is about 3 million years old from the late Miocene period. Anyways, if you're a university student in Florida, you're walking around on the remains of ancient coral all the time. Right. So reefs have been around for a very, very long time, as long as there have been biogenic rocky structures forming on planet Earth. And these biogenic rocky structures actually predate the evolution of multicellular life. Yes, the very first rocky structures made from made by living things were stromatolites. Stromatolites are basically these hardened microbial mats. So a microbial mat is when there's a film of microorganisms living on a substrate, and they sort of stick together and form a mat. And under some conditions of the right pH and water chemistry, those microbial mats can actually cause the precipitation of calcium carbonate, which means that dissolved calcium and carbonate ions in the water fuse and form a solid, and this sort of crustifies the microbial mat, if you will, and year after year, layers and layers of this calcium carbonate crust can build up underneath the microbial mat and create these weird sort of stool-like rocks that you find in shallow areas of the ocean. And if you saw through one of them, you can see all the different layers of microbial accretion of the reefs. So these stromatolites, we have fossil evidence of them forming up to 3 billion years ago, which is early in the Precambrian period. Life had only been around for a few 100 million years at that point. And there's actually a few places in the world, like Western Australia, where the conditions are right for stromatolites to continue forming today. So there are some places where we can see it's kind of like a window into the past, where we can see stromatolites forming today in a manner somewhat similar to how they would have formed 3 billion years ago. Scientists who like to split hairs, which is most of us, will say that, well, stromatolites are not true reef, because a true reef has a macroscopic skeletal framework. It's not just sort of encrusted microbial mat. It's like a real shell or skeleton creating a massive structure. So whether stromatolites are truly reefs or not is up for debate. The first organisms that we would consider to truly be reef formers were early animals. And what I'm going to show here is kind of an introduction to talking about some of these early groups of animals that made the first true reefs, is phylogeny of the kingdom Animalia. So phylogeny is like an evolutionary tree. So animals are multicellular organisms that evolved from single-celled protists, multicellular heterotrophic organisms that descended from a common ancestor, which eventually gave rise to all the animals. The early branches of the animal family tree are very primitive, if you will. They're things like sponges in the phylum Porifera, and that group in general is called Parazoa because they're so primitive in their body structure, they lack any kind of symmetry, that they're quite different from all the other animals. And some people don't even consider them to really quite be animals. They think that they're still kind of like just glorified protists. Anyways, once the animals got a little more sophisticated and they had symmetry to their bodies and sort of a organized form of development where they had different cell layers in the embryo, then we considered them to be true animals in this group of the animal family tree that we call Eumetazoa, like the good animals. So within those true animals, the fundamental division is between the radiata and the bilateria. So the radiata have radial symmetry, like you could slice them like a pizza and each slice would look the same, whereas bilateria, you could slice them down the middle and each side would look the same. They have bilateral symmetry. So with radial symmetry, we've got the phylum Nidaria, so that's the jellyfish and corals are in that primitive group of the eumetazoans. And then in the bilateria, there are many other phylums, and we won't get into all that, but some of them can contribute to reef formation as well, particularly the mollusks like the clams, mussels, and oysters. All right, so the earliest reefs that were made from a macroscopic skeletal framework were made from these primitive parazoas, sort of these multicellular animals that were closely related to sponges, although not quite the same thing as today's sponges. They had like real primitive body structures and development, but they were successful in reaching great abundance in the ancient oceans of the Cambrian period about 525 million years ago. They had a calcium carbonate skeleton, and their skeletons would pile up over time and accrete, which means build up into these reef structures that are evident in the fossil record still today. These things are not alive anymore. They were sort of outcompeted by other reef-forming organisms and other or filter feeders similar to modern sponges, but they left a nice record behind in the fossil record. Most reefs today are made of organisms in the phylum Cnidaria, which includes the jellyfish, sea anemones, etc. And the first Cnidarian reefs, the ones that had polyps with tentacles like today's reefs, those would have formed in the Ordovician period about 490 million years ago, so a little while after the archaeocyathids had their day. So since the first Cnidarian reefs appear in the fossil record 490 million years ago, there have been various times in Earth's history where there have been a lot of reefs or a little bit of reefs, And there have been certain periods where reefs have disappeared from the fossil record for a couple million years following some kind of global disaster that changed the ocean chemistry or caused mass extinctions in ways that wiped out reefs. So there was a period at the end of the Ordovician where there were no reefs for a while. Again, at the end of the Devonian, there was a really major extinction at the end of the Permian. The Permian Triassic extinction event was perhaps the greatest single extinction event in the last 500 million years. And then the famous dinosaur ending extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period also ended coral reefs for a few million years before they started to build up again in the last 30 million years or ago or so. And so they call these time periods in history that were reefless reef gaps. And one of the worrying things that scientists talk about today is whether we're going to enter another reef gap, a period where there's mass extinction of the reefs that we have today, and that will take millions of years to for us to recover from. Right, so in the past, when we've lost reefs due to natural changes in the Earth, these natural disasters, it's taken millions of years of recovery and evolution for reefs to sort of regain their glory. And we have glorious reefs today, but we're in danger of losing them because of humankind. So what are these things that are building our glorious reefs today? Well, there's certainly corals, these stony members of the phylum Nidaria, which I mentioned earlier. But members of the phylum Nidaria, these animals with tentacled polyps, are not the only things that make biogenic rocky structures. They're not the only reef formers today. There are some algae that form reefs. They call them Coraline algae. So they're algae that have calcium carbonate in their body structure, and they can sort of accrete and grow into these lumpy encrustations. Like this pink business here is a reef being formed from Coraline algae. In coral reefs as well, even when the major reef formers are corals, the Coraline algae can be sort of the glue in between that keeps the reef together. So reefs aren't necessarily only made by one thing. You could have a reef that's a mixture of corals and Coraline algae. Some types of worms of the family Sabellaridae, a type of polychaete worm, they make these tubes that are sort of calcified incrustations of sand and mucus, and those together can create a rocky biogenic structure that we would call a reef. Bivalve mollusks like clams, mussels, and oysters, in large accumulations, their fused shells form reefs. And this other type of mollusk, something that we don't think of as being a sessile organism normally, snails. So gastropods are snails. There are some types of gastropods that are sessile. So they crawl around like a regular snail when they're small. And unfortunately, my little video here is covering up that that picture, but they call them worm snails or vermeeted gastropods. So vermeeted means worm-like. So these worm snails, they settle in one spot, and their shell uncoils and becomes this kind of tangled spiral that tangles together with other worm snail shells, and that can form this encrustation of tangled tube-like shells, which are actually snails but look more like worm tubes or something, and that can form a reef. And those snails feed by filter feeding, so they don't need to crawl around anymore. All right, so lots of different interesting invertebrate organisms and algae in the ocean today can create reefs. And corals, of course, are the big ones that we'll talk a lot about, but there are other things that contribute to these reefs as well. So because corals are major reef formers, I want to say a little bit more about their biology and background. So corals, they're members of the phylum Nidaria. So the phylum Nidaria includes a really large variety of organisms, perhaps because it's such an ancient phyla. One of the first branches of the tree of animal life was the Cnidarians, and so they've since branched out and taken over the oceans. But they all have a few features in common. They all have radial symmetry. I said you could slice them like a pizza and every slice would look alike. That's what radial symmetry is. They have this simple body structure where they have one orifice that's both their mouth and their anus. They can reproduce asexually by splitting or cloning themselves, but they can also reproduce sexually by producing eggs and sperm. And when the egg and sperm meet, there's mitosis, and the cells divide and create this blob of cells that's called a Planula Larvae. That's what you see in, let me see if I can get the little pen here. This is the Planula Larvae. It's basically a ball of cells covered in cilia, and cilia are like little hairs, and the planula is able to swim around weakly and is able to kind of orient itself to where it wants to settle. And when it settles to the bottom, it will become a polyp. Polyp is the sessile form of Cnidarian, so it's got its tentacles facing upward, a little mouth, anus in the center, and it can do its thing there, snagging food particles from the water, being a host to symbiotic algae, and doing all the things that a polyp does. There's this other form of Cnidarian body structure as well. It's kind of like a polyp upside down, and that's called the Medusa Form. So a jellyfish is a Cnidarian that has a Medusa form, and of course it pulses around in the water, in the plankton, feeding on other plankton. So lining the tentacles of either a polyp or Medusa are these special cells called nematocysts or cnidocytes, and commonly they're called stinging cells because they're like miniature harpoons. They have a sensitive trigger on the outside, and if that trigger is tripped, the harpoon shoots out and it can inject their prey or whatever is trying to perturb them with poison, and that's helps them capture their prey. So even though their overall body structure might look kind of primitive, they have these really unique and specialized harpoon-like cells called nematocysts, which are perhaps one of the keys to their success over evolutionary time. So this is kind of zooming in on the tree of life to focus on the branches of the tree within the phylum Nidaria. So as you remember from general biology, the next level of taxonomic organization down from phylum is class. And so we're dividing up the phylum Nidaria into these 5 major classes. It's possible that these classes have been divided further since I made this diagram. Taxonomy is something that's constantly in flux, but these are general classifications as of the time of my recording this lecture. The ancestral Cnidarian, the one that gave rise to all the others, had radial symmetry, planula larvae, and stinging cells, but then various other features evolved or were lost in the course of evolution, and that's kind of what defines these other groups within the phylum Nidaria. So let's go from left to right here. First, the class Anthozoa. That's the class that includes the true corals, soft corals, sea anemones, and they're primitive in a sense because they don't have a Medusa stage. They don't have any stage in their life where they're swimming around like a jellyfish. They're always a polyp or a planula larvae. And then the next sort of branch in the tree, which unites all the other classes, is that they do have a Medusa stage. So it's thought that the evolution of the Medusa stage is sort of what set their ancestor apart from the Anthozoa. Some of them have a primitive Medusa. The Styrozoa or stalk jellyfish have this Medusa, which almost looks more like a polyp and maybe actually be attached to something like a piece of seaweed. And their planula is a little bit weird. It lacks cilia. The more typical Medusas that we're familiar with are the jellyfish. They're in the class Symphozoa and Cubozoa. And their Medusa has these sensory organs around the bell called ropalia, and really the Medusa is the main stage of their life. So the polyp form is usually just kind of a larval stage that's stuck to the bottom, and the main stage of their life is the big jellyfish stage that's pulsing around through the water. Final group that I want to mention is Hydrozoa. or hydrozoans. It's an incredibly diverse group, which includes coral-like organisms like fire coral, but it also includes jellyfish-like organisms, and they're interesting because their body structure is kind of primitive. Their polyps are not very fancy, but what their claim to fame is that they have this complex colonial structure with specialized zooids, which means that one organism that starts the colony divides and buds into two, which can bud into 3 or 4, and they remain fused together, but then the different individuals begin to develop specialized roles and can create this overall structure that is achieving complexity through its colony structure rather than through the complexity of any one individual polyp. And that there's sort of many branches of the hydrozoan class, many of them beautiful and diverse and complex. So we'll talk more about them later. So we'll focus for a little while now on the Cnidarians that specifically contribute to the formation of reefs. So we're going to sort of ignore the jellyfish and focus just on the types of Cnidarians that can form a biogenic rocky structure and contribute to reefs. So most of those are within the class Anthozoa. That's the class of Cnidarians that has no Medusa stage. That's why I've got the little jellyfish-like stage crossed out. They don't resemble jellyfish at any point in their life. And the class Anthozoa is divided into 2 subclasses, Hexacoralia and Octocoralia. Well, actually, there's a 3rd subclass, Seriantheria, a special group called the tube-dwelling anemones. I always forget the Seriantheria. The Hexacoralia and Octocoralia, they're nice though because the names sort of tell you something about them. Hexacoralia have 6-sided radial symmetry, hence the term hex, like a hexagon is a 6-sided shape. And then Octocoralia have 8-sided radial symmetry, like their polyps have 8 tentacles, hence Octocoralia. I underlined and bolded the order Scleractinia within the subclass Hexacoralia because those are the stony corals. So the majority of the classic reef-making corals that we have today are in the order Scleractinia. I underlined but didn't bold the Helioporacea because this is this one type of coral that is also sort of hard and reef-forming, but it's the one that doesn't happen to be in this order Scleractinia. And then there's an entirely different class within the Cnidaria that does have some members that form rocky biogenic structures, and that is the family Milleporidae within the class Hydrozoa. So that's the hydrocorals, which we also know as the fire corals. So the fire corals are in a really, really different group of the Cnidarians than the other Cnidarians. And the hydrocorals actually do have a Medusa stage. So their life cycle is very different from a regular coral life cycle. They have a larval stage that looks like a jellyfish. Zooming in further still, we're focusing on the subclass Hexacoralia within the class Anthozoa. And there are 5 groups in this subclass Hexacoralia that I want you to know. First is the Stony Corals. Usually they are stony, as the name implies. When I say calcified, that means do these organisms make a calcium carbonate skeleton like this? Do they form rock underneath them that can build up reefs? And the stony corals do, which is why they're called stony corals. Are they colonial? Yes, they are. So instead of just being one solitary polyp, they're usually many polyps fused together into what they call a colony. And they're your basic reef-forming corals. Also in the phylum, but not contributing to the physical structure of reefs, really is the order Actinaria, the sea anemones. So sea anemones are usually just like a single polyp out there by itself. They don't have a calcium carbonate skeleton. They're just jelly-like polyp that attaches to the bottom. Sometimes they can be colonial, but usually they're solitary, meaning it's just one polyp by itself. Even though these don't form the rocky structure of reefs, they are found on reefs, and they're important for reef organisms like the clownfish that live symbiotically with the anemones, made famous by this computer animated cartoon Finding Nemo. The clownfish lives symbiotically within anemones found on coral reefs. Corallimorpha, that's a weird group because they're usually solitary like anemones, and they can look very similar to anemones, but they have a calcium carbonate skeleton. So they are sort of like a coral that's just made up of one polyp. Then there's the Zoantheria or zoanthids. They look very similar to anemones, but they have kind of like a double row of tentacles. So instead of having just the tentacles going up, they would have some tentacles that kind of go down as well. And that's kind of what tells them apart from the zoanthids. They can be colonial. They're not always colonial, but they're more likely to be colonial than anemones are, and they're usually not very calcified, but sometimes they can be a little bit calcified. For every rule, there seems to be an exception in biology, and that's true in the class Anthozoa, of course. Antipatharia, that's the sort of a weird group of corals that are not very common on shallow reefs, but they're more common on deep sea reefs. They don't have a hard rocky skeleton, but they have kind of a tough, like fibrous skeleton made of proteins, sort of like your hair. And they look more like sea fans or bushes, and they are colonial. So let's look at some basic coral anatomy with this example of a scleractinian coral, a coral in the order Scleractinia. So what we're seeing here is a cutaway view of the coral. So here is the calcium carbonate skeleton, the sort of limestone base, and then the orange and yellow part here is the fleshy living tissue of the coral. And so the calcium carbonate skeleton is secreted at the base of the living tissue. That's where you can kind of see, if you saw open a coral, how layer upon layer of this calcium carbonate rock has been laid down as the coral tissue above it grows and expands. The polyps have an internal body cavity where they digest their food, and then also within their flesh, which is what this zoom up here shows, they've got these symbiotic algae, and we'll learn more about those symbiotic algae that live in the tissues of corals later. And then also on the outer layer of their skin, they've got these nematocysts or cnidocytes, the stinging cells that can fire at their prey or can help defend them. So that's what the basic structure of a coral polyp looks like, but the overall structure of the coral colony, how the polyps are arranged and how the calcium carbonate skeleton is laid down, varies tremendously. So you can have some coral colonies that are giant boulders, like the Diploria labyrinthiformis, the grooved brain coral found in the Caribbean, Porites furcata, the finger coral, which has little fingery projections covered in tiny polyps, Acropora palmata, which looks like a big dead tree trunk, with these very thick branches that are resistant to wave action, allowing it to survive in the wave-beaten crests of waves, or the fore reef where big waves impact. Agaricea tenuifolia, the lettuce coral, which grows in sort of these thin lettuce-like sheaths. And Orbicella faviolata, the mountainous star coral, which has sort of these knobby mountain-like mounds. And this is just 5 species of corals found in the Caribbean. There is a tremendous diversity of coral form in coral species from around the world. So this is just a little sampler of the variety of stony coral shapes that you can get in the Caribbean. And I'll go on and talk about some of the other cool organisms from the Caribbean. So we're still within the subclass Hexacoralia here, but now we're talking about the anemones, the order Actinaria, rather than the order Scleractinia. So these anemones have no skeleton; they're mushy, but they have interesting looks as well. Condylactis gigantea is the giant anemone. It's one of the most beautiful ones in the Caribbean, but it's not the only type. Stichodactyla helianthus, the sun anemone, is also a beautiful anemone found in the Caribbean. I don't know what the common name is for Actinoporus elegans, but it's one that you'll find in very shallow areas like seagrass beds sometimes. Now we're looking at the corallomorphs. These are the organisms that I said had some traits similar to anemones, like usually being solitary with large polyp, and some traits similar to the Scleractinians, meaning that they had a calcium carbonate skeleton. And there's a variety of species of corallomorphs found in the Caribbean as well as the Indo-Pacific. Ricordia florida, the one in the upper left-hand here, has, I don't know how easy it is to see in the YouTube video, but this one has 2 symbiotic shrimps living in it. And these symbiotic shrimps can be found in both corallomorphs and anemones in coral reefs, and they live together with their hosts, kind of similar to the way the clownfish live symbiotically with anemones in the Indo-Pacific. This slide is showing organisms from the order Zoantheria. So these are the ones that have that sort of weird type of polyp that's got tentacles that go up and tentacles that go down. They may be colonial. Certainly they're colonial and fused together in the white encrusting zoanthid Palithoa caribiorum, this sort of weird rubbery white crust that can cover the reef. Zoanthus pulchella is another colonial one that kind of has these pretty greenish polyps. Parazoanthus swifti has orange polyps. Parazoanthus parasiticus, I think they changed the genus name on this one, but this one is called the sponge zoanthid, and it's interesting because it lives within a sponge and the polyps stick out the side of the sponge. So it sort of looks like the sponge has been parasitized by the zoanthid, but I don't think that it kills the sponge to have the zoanthid living in it. It's sort of a commensal relationship where the sponge can still survive with the infestation of Cnidarian polyps. And then these are the Antipitherians, what we call the black corals or the horny corals. And these pictures are taken in deeper water where these things are usually found. Some of them have weird structures where they look like a long rope. Others look more like a fan or a feathery bush. Okay, so we're moving on to a different subclass. So we're done with the Hexacoralia, and now we're on to the Octocoralia. These are the ones that have 8-sided radial symmetry, and so their polyps have 8 tentacles. The order Alcyonaceae is very conspicuous on reefs. It includes what we call the soft corals, as well as what we call sea plumes and sea fans. And so they have some calcium carbonate elements in their skeleton, but they're not like inflexible. They can sort of bend and flex with waves and currents, and that's part of their adaptation. They grow faster because they don't have to secrete this hard skeleton like the stony corals do. And sometimes in reefs that are frequently disturbed by storm events and things, there will be more of the soft corals than there are hard corals. This other order within the class Anthozoa is the sea pens. And they're really not coral-like at all, except that they are a colonial Cnidarian. They are, instead of attaching to hard substrates, they have a stalk that lets them attach to sort of mud and sand. And then they've got this sort of feathery plume that comes up. And then the Helioparaceae, they're sort of the black sheep of the subclass Octocoralia because their body structure is really more like a stony coral. They have a stony skeleton. And little polyps that come out of the stony skeleton. So here's some pictures of members of the order Alcyonaceae. This is Gorgonia Ventalina, the common sea fan. It's found in the Caribbean. It's beautiful purple. There's Antillogorgia bipinnata, which is a type of sea plume, which is this a common term for Alcyonaceae that look like a feather. And then there's various types of deep water sea fans like Isologorgia schrammi. The picture where we're looking at a close-up view of the polyps, Plexaurella, that is a type of Alcyonaceae called a sea rod, and it's sort of this, has thicker branches than a sea fan or a sea plume, and it's really cool to look at the 8 tentacled polyps that come out of the thing. You can also see in the polyps on these things that there are little branches on the tentacles, so they have pinnate branching on the tentacles. So each tentacle has little feather-like projections coming off of it, and that's something that you would not have on the Hexacoralia. That's only in the Octocoralia that they have the branching tentacles, so very distinct from the Hexacoralia. Another thing that these Alcyonaceae, which they sometimes call octocorals, can do is they can retract their polyp completely beneath this sort of tough skin of the colony that they call the rind, leaving only like a little puckered hole. And you can kind of see here, there's sort of the little pucker or slit that the polyp has retracted into. And so that can give these octocorals a really different look when their polyps are extended, and they look sort of like these bushy brushes, to where when the polyps are retracted, they look kind of like a wiry dead bush or something like that, like a bush that's lost its leaves or something. This is that weird member of the subclass Octocoralia, the Helioporaceae. And Heliopora cerulea is the only species in this group, and it's basically a hard coral, but it's not related to the other hard corals. It's not in the order Scleractinia. It's for better or worse, it has this beautiful blue skeleton. And that beautiful blue skeleton is sought after by collectors. I've actually seen these skeletons in like tourist shops and home decor shops here in Florida, even though it doesn't grow in Florida. It's only found in the Indo-Pacific, and so that means that some reef in the Indo-Pacific has been raided, and people have taken the coral out and killed it and sold it to Americans in a home decorating store, which is really tragic, because these are slow-growing organisms that are important to forming the structure of the reef, and really there's no way that I know of to sustainably harvest corals off the reef. It destroys the reef when you do that. So if you ever see this blue coral for sale in a store, you should maybe talk to the store manager and ask him, do you know where you're getting this coral? Like, this is not a cool thing to be selling. Anyways, I'm editorializing a little bit, and I should stop that and move on. Okay, so this last class within the the last subclass within the class Anthozoa is the subclass Seriantheria. These are the tube anemones, and they're different from regular anemones because they have this sort of double ring of tentacles. They kind of have tentacles that come out of their throat, as well as the tentacles that are around the rim of their stalk. And they also have this ability to sort of retract into a kind of leathery mucus-lined tube beneath the sediment, and they're sort of tube or stalk that they build allows them to attach in muddy and sandy places, so they don't necessarily need a rock or something else hard to attach to, like most of the other things that we call anemones would need. Moving on, we're now in a totally different branch of the Cnidarian family tree. We're no longer in the class Anthozoa, we're in the class Hydrozoa. So this class of Cnidarians does have a Medusa larval stage. So instead of having just a Planula larvae, they have a jellyfish-like larvae. And there's various orders within this subclass that create coral-like organisms on the reefs, and The one that you need to know if you're in the Caribbean is this sort of yellowish colored one called fire coral, Millepora alcicornis. It sort of has this smooth appearance, but if you look up close at the polyps, you can you can see these little fine hairs that seem to be coming out, and those are stinging tentacles that come out. And so it has this really interesting body structure, but if you get up there to try to inspect it, you're liable to be stung by it. This is one of the only corals in the Caribbean, perhaps the only coral in the Caribbean where the sting is bad enough that it will hurt a human. The other corals, their stinging cells sting hard enough that they can capture plankton and stuff, but they wouldn't irritate a person that touched them, whereas this one, it would be really unpleasant to touch this. Okay, let's talk about how corals eat. There's sort of two ways that corals get their food, and one is the way that any kind of Cnidarian with a polyp gets its food. It's by capturing suspended particles with its tentacles. So the polyp is this sort of simple system for capturing and eating things. Basically, there's a lot of floating particles of food in the water. If they hit the tentacles of the polyp can eat that particle of food. There's a little mouth, anus, in the center of the polyp, and it's a convenient system for capturing food. The thing is, in the environments where coral reefs live, there tends to be like a low concentration of food particles in the water. So just waiting to capture food particles in your tentacles, you might not get much food. Something that can help with that is if you're in an area where there's strong currents sweeping through, because that will bring a lot of food particles by, even if the food particles are relatively widely spaced in the water. So coral reefs, as well as other ecosystems based on filter-feeding organisms, tend to grow faster in areas where there are strong currents, because that increases the flux of particles that become available for the organisms that are waiting there to catch them and eat them. So you tend to get faster growth of corals and other filter-feeding organisms in areas with strong currents. And they don't just eat like just phytoplankton or just zooplankton. They'll pretty much eat whatever kind of edible particles might be drifting along in the water, and for that reason they call them cosmopolitan consumers. They'll eat phytoplankton, zooplankton, pieces of dead detrital material, pieces of fecal matter that are falling through the water. Any little potentially edible particle that gets caught in their tentacles, they will eat. And then they've got this other way of feeding themselves as well, and that is with a symbiotic relationship that they have evolved with a type of single-celled algae called Symbiodinium, which is also referred to as zooxanthellae. So these zooxanthellae are members of the group of photosynthetic protists called dinoflagellates. So dinoflagellates, most of them are planktonic. So the typical dinoflagellate is a little cell that has two flagella, and it's photosynthetic, and it sort of drifts around in the surface waters like other phytoplankton, photosynthesizing, getting light from the sun, and reproducing, and it just sort of lives in the plankton. But what's different about dinoflagellates in the genus Symbiodinium is that instead of drifting around in the plankton their whole lives, they live all their life, or most of their life, embedded within the flesh of the coral. And so they don't need to have the flagella and all that kind of stuff for swimming around in the water. They just sit there inside the meat of the coral, and light passes through the skin of the coral, so they get enough light to photosynthesize, and they just do their thing inside the coral. So they benefit the coral because as they photosynthesize within the coral, they sort of leach out the extra carbohydrates that they make through their photosynthesis. So they're sort of like feeding the coral the extra organic matter that they produce via photosynthesis. And so the coral sort of has this internal garden that is supplying it with carbohydrates that it feeds off of. Also, as the zooxanthellae are photosynthesizing, it removes dissolved carbon dioxide from inside the tissue of the coral, and that means that it raises the pH of the environment within and around the coral polyp, and that makes a more favorable environment for the coral to calcify. So calcification is where the coral takes calcium ions and carbonate ions and stitches them together to precipitate calcium carbonate, which is the limestone material that it packs together to build up its skeleton. And so in a high pH environment, a basic environment, it's able to get more carbonate and more efficiently create its skeleton. So that's one of the ways, besides feeding the coral, the zooxanthellae benefits the coral is by creating a nice pH environment. So what does the zooxanthellae get out of this relationship? It gets something too. It gets protection. So a dinoflagellate that's just drifting around as a phytoplankton cell can be eaten by anything at any moment, whereas a zooxanthellae cell that's nestled within the flesh of a coral is protected from predation living there. Also, the coral, because it is suspension feeding at the same time that it's growing its zooxanthellae garden, it's getting access to some food and nutrition from the particles that it eats. And as it digests that food, it releases wastes like ammonia and phosphate. And those wastes can immediately be picked up by the zooxanthellae, which of course needs some nitrogen and phosphorus to grow. So it's kind of like a recycling system within the tissue of the coral, where the coral's wastes end up being turned back into food by the zooxanthellae, thanks to the zooxanthellae's photosynthetic abilities, and then the organic matter that the zooxanthellae produces can be eaten by or absorbed by the coral polyp. So it's really a great relationship. But like a lot of relationships, it's difficult. I mean, the two partners are both giving a lot, but they're also taking, and relationships break down sometimes. You know, so one party feels that they're giving more than they're receiving in return, and there's a breakup. So who broke up with who is something that scientists are still kind of trying to figure out a little bit. But the upshot is that when conditions are harsh, maybe the water temperature is too high, or the acidity is bad, there's stress from sedimentation, or there's something unhappy about the environment, then the happy relationship is over, and either the zooxanthellae are expelled or the zooxanthellae leave on their own, and you end up with this empty, bleached white coral. Because the color in the coral is not usually made by the coral flesh itself. The color comes from the symbiotic zooxanthellae. So with the zooxanthellae gone, you've just got this transparent coral flesh, which is transparent, kind of like a jellyfish is transparent. You see straight through it to the white calcium carbonate skeleton beneath. So you've got this ghostly white, kind of beautiful, but possibly doomed coral, which has lost its internal garden. And these bleached corals can sometimes regain their zooxanthellae if the stressful conditions go away. Then they get back together again. The zooxanthellae regrow and the coral regains its nutrition. Other times, bleaching is a prelude to death. So if the conditions stay bad, the zooxanthellae don't come back, the coral will starve and die. And sometimes when a coral is weakened by bleaching and sort of the loss of nutrition that's associated with bleaching, it's more vulnerable to diseases, and so diseases might be the thing that then strike and wipe it out after bleaching. So bleaching is really obvious to see, like if you're a diving marine biologist snorkeling over the reef, and it's a big warning sign. If you see bleaching, the coral diseases and death may be right around the corner. Interesting thing about zooxanthellae is that they're found not only in corals, but in some other sessile organisms that live on reefs. Zooxanthellae are found in anemones, and corallomorphs, other Cnidarians, but they're also found in members of some other invertebrate phyla, like this mollusk, the giant clam, Tridacna gigas. Unlike most clams, which keep themselves mostly closed most of the time and just filter feed through their siphon, this clam gapes open and exposes its fleshy mantle to the sun because its fleshy mantle is full of symbiotic zooxanthellae, and those zooxanthellae are photosynthesizing and giving nutrition to the clam the same way that they do to the corals. And you can see that the corals in the background of this picture are also all these rich tones of green and brown and yellow, and all of that color is from the zooxanthellae living in them. So the beautiful colors of the reef are largely related to the symbiotic zooxanthellae that live in the coral. All right, so while I'm on this topic of zooxanthellae, I want to share a little side story. There's this term vignette, which kind of means a side story. And it comes from the olden days when people who would make books kind of in the ancient times before printing presses would kind of make these doodles around the cover or the chapters in the book that would sometimes tell a little side story, like there might be bugs or lizards chasing each other around in this little vine that covers the margins of the page of a new chapter in the book or something, and they call those vignettes. So here's a little side story, a little vignette related to the zooxanthellae. It's based on a paper by Thaler et al. So we originally thought that zooxanthellae were all just one kind of organism, one species in the genus Symbiodinium. But and I can understand that because they all look pretty similar. They're these little round cells. But with genetic techniques, we realized that zooxanthellae, even though different types of zooxanthellae look similar, they are genetically different and they're phenotypically different, meaning that they have different sort of behaviors or responses to different environmental conditions. Like some have evolved to photosynthesize efficiently in warm conditions with bright light, which might be found in waters near the surface, and others photosynthesize more efficiently in somewhat darker waters that are a little bit cooler, deeper down. And even in one species of coral, like the Caribbean coral Orbicelia annularis, I think it's called the great star coral. I'm not sure what the common name of Orbicella annularis is, but it's this big mound-like coral. It's got different types of zooxanthellae that live in it, and in the shallow depths you see types A and B, which are adapted to bright, warm conditions, and then in the deeper depths you see type C, adapted to cooler, darker conditions. And at mid-depths you sometimes have this interesting thing where there'll be multiple types of zooxanthellae within one coral colony. And the sort of the more shaded parts of the colony will have type C, and the other parts will have types A and B. And if there's some sort of bright sunlight or hot water event that affects the reef, some of the zooxanthellae might die out, but others might still survive. And you can end up with this weird, you can end up with this weird sort of partial bleaching condition where you can see some of the zooxanthellae have been lost from this Orbicella annularis, but some are still there. So it's possible that if one type of the zooxanthellae was expelled, then the types that survived might recolonize it. And one of the implications of this is you're most likely to lose the zooxanthellae if they're kind of existing in a situation where the conditions are just barely suitable for them, like if it's the bright light species but it's kind of in dim light, or the dim light species but it's kind of in bright light. One of the things that can happen is if the conditions change, you might sort of lose one of the types of zooxanthellae, but another will take its place, and that can maybe help the coral survive. But if the conditions are really unstable and they're changing a lot, there's not going to be enough time for the sort of zooxanthellae type to be changed out before in order to adapt to those rapid changes. So this is one of the reasons that it's really important for coral reef environments to be stable over time, because an unstable environment will prevent them from being able to sort of adapt and find the optimum pairing of zooxanthellae and coral. Let's talk about how corals grow. Corals grow slowly, even compared to other slow-growing things like trees. They grow even slower than that. And how slow they grow kind of depends on what type of coral they are and how we're measuring their growth rate. So the fastest growing corals are branching corals, like Acropora cervicornis. That's the antler-like species in the upper picture here. A single branch of Acropora cervicornis under ideal conditions might grow about 20 centimeters a year, about this much in a year. But a big mounding coral like the brain coral in the lower picture there, it would grow more slowly, like only a couple millimeters a year. And so you could imagine it would take hundreds of years for the colony to go from little to huge. And then the growth of an individual coral is different from like the increase in the size of the reef as a whole, because the reef is made up of many corals, but there's also gaps between the corals, and some of the corals will be dying or breaking up, and some of the corals will be growing. And so you have to kind of consider the whole landscape picture. How much of the bottom is covered with coral? How fast are those corals growing? What's happening in the gaps between the corals? What's breaking down the corals? And so when you sort of take into account all those factors that might be contributing to coral growth or coral breakdown, the net result is sort of like what the overall elevation of the coral is doing over time. And we call that the accretion of the reef. So the overall reef structure made up of many corals covering the reef could be accreting fast or slow, but rarely do reefs accrete more than a few millimeters a year. And it's interesting to think about those rates of coral accretion, because a few millimeters a year is on par with the rates of sea level rise. So there's kind of like a slow motion race between how fast is the reef building up and how fast is the sea level rising. So we know that some reefs have sort of sustained themselves over the last 10,000 years or so, when there was 130 meters of sea level rise. It happened slow enough that the reefs were able to build up and stay in shallow waters near the surface all that time, and you sort of have these like towers underwater of coral reefs that kept up with sea level rise as during the thaw from the last ice age. But there are other areas where sea level was rising faster than the coral reefs were keeping up, so now you've got these sort of drowned reefs in deep dark waters where they can no longer live because they couldn't keep up with sea level rise. So it's kind of tricky, and from geologists, and geology and biology kind of overlap here, because the biology sort of determines the overall growth and accretion rates of the corals that make up the reefs. The biology determines that, but then you also need to consider the geology, like the erosion and the sea level rise that's breaking down the reef, and how that all balances out and determines whether the reef is ultimately sustaining itself in the long term or not. One of the interesting findings from studies of reefs in the Florida Keys over the last several decades is that the sea bottom in the Florida Keys on average is now deeper than it used to be, because the reefs stopped growing because many of the corals died, and then erosion was still happening, so there was no coral growth, but there was continuing erosion. And so now areas that used to be like shallow on the bathymetric maps that sailors would have are now deeper, because the bottom has sort of rotted away as the reef structures have crumbled and eroded. So we know that some areas are suitable for reefs to grow, and they've grown and sustained themselves over thousands and millions of years. Other areas don't have any reefs at all. So what is it that makes an environment suitable for a reef to form? it turns out that it's more than one thing. One of the most basic requirements is you need a hard substrate. So corals need a stable platform to grow on. So they need to have some kind of rock, or which might be volcanic rock, or they need to have some kind of remains of a previous coral reef, something hard to grow on, to attach to. So they need that hard substrate to start out. They need consistently high salinity, so they need salinity steady around 35 parts per thousand. Most corals are not tolerant of low salinity conditions. You're not going to find corals in brackish water estuaries, for example. So you've got to have a stable salinity. You've got to have light to support the zooxanthellae. There are some species of corals that can grow in deep, dark waters without any sunlight or symbiotic algae, but they grow much more slowly than the shallow water corals. And if you're in a shallow water environment where you are constantly facing threats from erosion from waves and being pecked at by grazers and other things, you need to be able to grow pretty fast to maintain yourself. So without light, you're in trouble. Temperature needs to be warm, but not too warm, and it needs to be steady. There needs to be a decent water flow to supply the polyps with particles to feed on, and also to sort of keep the waters around the reef from becoming stagnant and low in dissolved oxygen. So you need all those things, and you need them constantly. Like if there's a little while that the temperature gets too hot or too cold, that can kill the reef, and it will take like a very long time for the reef to recover, because the reef is alive, right? So you could have an environment where like 11 months of the year the environment was just fine for coral growth, but if there's 1 month of the year where it was too cold, then you wouldn't be able to get corals there, because the corals take more than 11 months to grow, right? And if all your corals die before they're 1 year old, you're never going to build up a reef. So you have to have stability to the environment. You have to have an environment that's like year-round good conditions for the corals to survive. And so the consequences of that is that you only have corals growing in the sort of tropical areas where the water temperature conditions are sort of warm and stable and brightly lit year-round. So this shows where corals live, and it's color-coded also by the number of different species of corals that can be found in those areas. As you can see, the Indo-Pacific, what they call the Coral Triangle, sort of north of Australia between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, is the most diverse area in the world for corals, as well as for many other marine species like fishes. And we've got a respectable number of corals in the Caribbean, but really compared to the Indo-Pacific, we're nothing. What's odd about this diagram is that there are some areas of the tropics where there are no reefs. For example, on the west coast of Africa, there's sort of this reefless area. On the west coast of South America, even though it's right around the equator, there's also no reefs in that area. And the reason for that has to do with sort of temperature and nutrients. These are areas where there's a lot of upwelling of cold water, and that upwelling of cold water creates unsuitable conditions for reef growth and very good conditions for algae growth. So the water tends to be kind of murky with phytoplankton, and the bottom is covered by fast-growing seaweeds. And both of those things sort of outcompete corals, and you tend not to have corals in these upwelling areas, even though they're at tropical latitudes. On the other side of South America, there is not upwelling there, so it's not limited by the water being too cold there. But this is where the Amazon River comes out, and there's a lot of other rivers that come out in this area, and that sort of limits the amount of coral that can grow in these areas, because the water is really muddy. It's often brackish with fresh water mixed in, and that's one of the things that prevents much corals from growing in that area. An interesting thing that you might want to think about is why there are so many more species of corals in the Indo-Pacific than there are in the Eastern Pacific or the Caribbean. And That's an interesting question of biogeography that I won't belabor here, but there are some interesting theories as to why that is, and I encourage you to look into that. So I mentioned that with reefs, we can kind of study them from a geological perspective because they're such large rocky accumulations that you can kind of study them like you study other geological structures like mountains and valleys. And you can also study them from a biological perspective, focusing on the individual organisms that build up the reefs. But let's take a look at that geological perspective and how we sort of classify different geological features of the reef. First, we'll talk about this basic form of reef that they call a fringing reef. Fringing reef abuts the land, which means it comes up next to the land. So this is the land here. I can indicate that by drawing a palm tree. Looks kind of like a flower more than a palm tree. Maybe if I add some coconuts. All right, so that's a palm tree, and this is the land, and this fringing reef comes right up to the land. This shallow area of the reef, which can even be intertidal, it's so shallow, right along the edge of the land is called a reef flat. At the edge of the reef flat, there's what they call a reef crest. That would tend to be where waves are breaking. As the sort of the waves that are out here in the ocean meet that shallow water, they break, and it'll be sheltered in the lagoon, or sheltered in the reef flat. So that's the reef crest. Where it drops off beyond the reef crest into deeper water, they call that the forereef. And the forereef tends to be a really good place to scuba dive because there's a lot of dramatic ups and downs there. I'm trying to draw a scuba diver, and it's not going so well. So the forereef would be a good place to scuba dive. And then there's a bank or shelf, which is just kind of this deep water area of the reef. And then an escarpment where the reef drops off into deep water. Not all reefs have all these features, but this is kind of a general feature that you might have along the shores of an island, for example. This is what a reef flat looks like in the Indo-Pacific. As I mentioned, they can be intertidal, so some of the corals are actually partially exposed at a low tide. And this is an extensive reef flat. You'd have a long and perilous walk if you wanted to walk out from this to the reef crest at the edge there to find your way to deeper water. It's also perilous to snorkel over a reef flat because even at high tide, it's still quite shallow. And if there's waves going up and down, when you're in the trough of the wave, you could scrape your belly on the sharp corals sticking up out of the reef flat. Another reef formation is a barrier reef. So a barrier reef has all the same things as a fringing reef has. It's got the forereef here, and it's got the crest of the reef here. It's got the flat of the reef here. But then instead of the reef flat coming directly up against the land, you've got this deeper water in between the reef flat and the land, and they call that the lagoon. So the lagoon is this sort of protected water where the big waves have been broken by the reef crest and the reef flat, and then you've just sort of got this sheltered water of the lagoon, which might have a sandy bottom or seagrass, or there can actually be little patches of reef in the lagoon as well. They call those patch reefs if there's little chunks of reef in the lagoon. There's this interesting feature that you can see on the forereef here where there's these kind of stripes in it. They call this a spur and groove formation, and that's a feature that you get on some forereef environments where there's these sand channels and then these towering walls of coral that kind of go perpendicular to the reef crest there. Also a really exciting environment to snorkel through, and a place where there's a lot of hiding places for animals and such. I mentioned that there could be chunks of reef within the lagoon, and that's what we see here. This is a patch reef, just kind of a big mound of corals within the relatively protected waters of the lagoon. Patch reefs are a really nice place to snorkel because since they're in the lagoons, they tend to be in relatively sheltered water and shallow, so easy to snorkel on. This is kind of another conceptual diagram from an atlas of corals of the world that shows sort of where you'd find some of these different reefs that we were just talking about. This shows a fringing reef. Here's one against the mainland. Here's some against an island here. It is possible to have Reef Flat even if there's no island in the center of it, and that's what you would get if you got a platform reef. So it's sort of like it gets shallow enough to be a Reef Flat, but there's no actual island in the center of it. Conversely, you could have a reef that doesn't really have any super shallow part, and they call that a bank reef. So that would not be such a good place to snorkel. You would probably need to scuba dive to get to down to the bank reef. And then a barrier reef is one that's far separated from the mainland, but comes up into shallow water and creates this sort of barrier with a lagoon behind it. So just some examples of different kinds of reef features that you can have. So I mentioned banks being a type of reef that comes up not into very shallow water. So like the shallowest parts of a bank reef are still pretty deep. In the Gulf of Mexico, there are some bank reefs far from shore in areas that are not that often visited by divers or even fishers. So the flower garden banks are located in an unlikely place, relatively at a high latitude in the Gulf of Mexico, kind of near the cities of Houston and Galveston. So the nearshore waters here are really muddy, murky, and polluted. And it's ironic that if you just go a bit further out, though, you can get to these clear blue waters that are not very influenced by runoff from land, where there's these gorgeous deep water reefs called the flower garden banks. There's something a little bit similar off of the Florida Panhandle called the Florida Middle Ground. Not quite as pristine and gorgeous as the flower garden banks, but still an interesting bank reef environment. This is an underwater picture from the flower garden banks. You can see there's a giant sea anemone here, Condylactis gigantea, with its purple-tipped tentacles. And you can see there is all this pink stuff. And the pink stuff is Coraline algae. So it's this algae that actually is full of calcium carbonate and actually sort of contributes to the buildup of the reef. You also see a variety of fish in the background. I think I see a squirrel fish here, a butterfly fish here, and a damselfish here. So a really amazing, beautiful environment if you can get out there. This is from the Florida Middle Grounds. As I said, not quite as glamorous a reef, but still full of life. And there's some various species of coral here, and these fishes are white grunts out on the Florida Middle Grounds. There's sort of a special formation of reefs that you find around isolated islands in the middle of the ocean. And these isolated islands tend to be volcanic in origin, so it's sort of a volcano that's coming up from the seafloor and sort of creating a shallow water area where there wasn't one in the past. And an early naturalist in the 19th century, you may have heard of him, Charles Darwin, on his ocean cruises, the same cruises where he was developing his theory of evolution, which is now the basis of all modern biology, he was making interesting observations of coral reefs around the world. And he noted that some of the islands he visited had fringing reefs, where the reefs sort of came right up to the edge of the island. Others had a barrier reef, and there would be sort of a lagoon that you'd have to go through to get to the main part of the island. And then other islands were just kind of a ring of reefs or shallow or low elevation islands with no visible mountain or anything in the center at all. And so Darwin kind of hypothesized that these three environments were just sort of different stages in millions of years long kind of geological cycle where the island would form due to volcanic forces or whatever. Then the reef would start to grow around the edge of the island. But then the island would sort of subside and erode and kind of crumble and sink back into the ocean. But as the volcanic part of the island was kind of crumbling and sinking back into the ocean, the coral reef part would still be growing. And if the growth was fast enough, it could stay close to the surface. And eventually, even when the rest of the island had sort of crumbled and sunken away, you'd still have this ring of reef-formed island that would come right up to the surface. And this theory was confirmed by drilling. Scientists drilled cores through the different layers of limestone rock that were sort of the living and then ancient reef, and you could see the layer upon layer of reef growth, sometimes a kilometer thick of calcium carbonate rock was between the surface reef and the ancient volcanic bedrock that it was built on. So just an unimaginably long period of reef growth had sort of over the millennia built up this structure and kept up with sea level rise even as the island that it was originally based around subsided into the sea. So these are just incredibly cool ancient geological and biological structures. One of the most majestic atolls in the world is Eniwetok Atoll in the Pacific. This is what Eniwetok Atoll looks like from high above in an airplane. You can see that it's a massive ring of reefs and low-lying islands around a beautiful crystal blue lagoon. Eniwetok Atoll was inhabited by Polynesian people for hundreds of years. But during this period of conflict in the 20th century, World War II, and in the aftermath of World War II, Eniwetok Atoll was sort of a staging area for different military activities in the conflict of nations across the Pacific Ocean. So the United States was originally fighting Japan and then worried about other rivals like Russia and China overseas. And we thought that this very isolated island would be the perfect place to test the most powerful nuclear weapons in the world, so even more powerful than the ones that we had dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. So hydrogen bombs, and so one of the most powerful bombs ever exploded in the world was exploded on this poor island after they had evicted the native people who lived there for generations. We set up this tremendous bomb on the island. And it predictably irradiated the island. It blew open this giant crater, and the island was uninhabitable for a very long period of time because of the radiation. Even today, there's high levels of radiation on the island. They've tried to clean it up by taking the most radioactive rock and debris and scraping it all into this pile and covering it over with a cement dome. But it's kind of leaky, and the people that have eventually, after decades, moved back to their ancestral home are now getting sick at high rates because they're still exposed to really high levels of radiation. So it's kind of a tragedy to have this ancient ancestral home and then be displaced from it, and then when you can finally return, it's kind of another tragedy because you're getting sick and your babies have birth defects and that sort of thing. Of course, this wasn't good for the marine life either. Marine life are equally susceptible to radiation to terrestrial life. So hopefully our species, humanity, can get to a point where we don't feel like we have to use nuclear weapons and test them anymore, and we can stop blowing up the most beautiful places in the world. Let's change the topic here a little bit from death to sex. Corals need to reproduce like every living organism does to pass on their genes and continue themselves. And they've got interesting ways of doing it. Corals can reproduce asexually by budding and fragmentation, and they can also reproduce sexually by making eggs and sperm. So let's talk about the asexual reproduction first, because there's in colonial organisms, asexual reproduction and growth are kind of weirdly overlapping. So the interesting thing about corals is no matter how big the coral colony is, the individual polyps of the coral are all a certain size. So the coral starts out as a single polyp, and for the coral colony to get bigger, that polyp needs to bud into two polyps. Those need to bud into two more, and so on. And that sort of fission, where one organism sort of pops into two, which remain stuck together, is sort of what allows the colonies to grow. It would be sort of like if you split yourself into a Siamese twin that you had right here, but we're still fused at the arms, and then the twins split into another twin, and it would end up being like paper dolls, and you have sort of a whole chain of you that were all stuck together. That would be like how colonial growth happens. So it's both asexual reproduction in a way, because you're creating more polyps, but they're remaining fused in a colony, and so that's kind of how the colony grows. So that asexual reproduction and colony growth are kind of one and the same thing. But this thing can happen to the colony. Like you get a big colony, and it can split up. And usually corals don't split themselves up on purpose, but if something breaks off one of the branches, that branch could survive, and if it lodges into the coral reef, it can grow and create its own new coral colony. So you see that in the picture here. There's a little fragment that breaks off of this branching coral, and that fragment grows and becomes another large colony. Some corals fragment easier than others, like branching corals fragment readily. Something like a big boulder brain coral might not fragment so easily, although it is possible if you've got like a big coral colony, if something happens and it's like broken into two, then the two parts might each be able to sort of grow, and it would eventually become two colonies that could potentially fuse together again. So it is possible for one massive coral colony to be split in two, and then the two pieces grow. That would be fragmentation. All right, so enough of the asexual reproduction. Let's talk about the sexual reproduction. So corals produce sperm and eggs, and the sperm and eggs, when they get together, they form a zygote. The zygote divides and forms this multicellular blob covered in cilia that's called a planula. The plural is planulae. The Planula larvae, if it finds a suitable place, it settles to the bottom, sticks itself down there, and then it undergoes this metamorphosis. It first looks like this weird thing, and then it will become a polyp like the ones up here. And then that polyp can grow by asexual division to form a new colony. There's some variety to coral sex. Some coral species release both the eggs and sperm into the water, and others release just the sperm into the water, and the sperm will fertilize eggs that are kept within the coral colony of another coral. So sometimes both the sperm and the eggs are released and they meet in the water. Sometimes just the sperm are released and they find their way to a coral and swim inside and find the eggs. Either way, at the end of that, you end up with a fertilized egg. The fertilized egg becomes a Planula larvae, which settles and grows into a new colony. So the corals that release both eggs and sperm are called spawners, and the corals that release just the sperm, which swim their way to another coral and swim into it and find the eggs, are called brooders, because they brood the eggs. They hang on to the eggs inside the mother coral. And interestingly, most corals produce both sperm and eggs, so the same individual will produce both sperm and eggs, and because they're able to produce both sperm and eggs at the same time, we call them simultaneous hermaphrodites. Some corals are sequential hermaphrodites, like the same individual can produce both eggs and sperm, but it won't make them at the same times. Like it'll make eggs, and then a while later it'll make sperm, and there might be different periods of time in between when it makes one or the other. And then some have separate sexes. They're gonochoristic like humans, where either you make eggs or you make sperm, and you don't make both. So some corals are like that. There's a coral in the Caribbean called pillar coral, which is really super duper endangered. And one of the reasons it's endangered is because it's gonochoristic. So one of the last coral colonies remaining might be like a male, and maybe there's no female coral colonies in that area. So it's just releasing sperm into the water that never find eggs to fertilize. So being gonochoristic could be a problem if you're an endangered species. Here's a picture of corals releasing their eggs and sperm on a moonlit night in midsummer. And this is a big event where they're released in massive numbers. And so this is one coral colony that's releasing a bunch of eggs and sperm. But imagine all the coral colonies of this species on the reef are doing this. And in fact, all the corals of other species are releasing their eggs and sperm on the same night as well. And so it's just this massively coordinated event. And it's not just coincidence that all the corals spawn at one time. You got to think about, like, what would the benefit be for them all to synchronize their spawning and have this massive synchronized spawning event. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it increases their chances of successfully fertilizing. So it's kind of like a big speed dating event for corals. If they all show up to the orgy at the same time, then they're all gonna get lucky. Whereas if it's just one comes to the party and decides to release its eggs and sperm, it's probably not gonna end well. So everyone coordinating their sex all at once is how they increase their success. And also the fact that they're all doing it at once means that the things that might want to eat their eggs and sperm, like the little fishes and plankton in the water, there's going to be so much eggs and sperm in the water that they can't eat it all, and that's going to prevent and that's going to allow some to survive. Kind of like when a sea turtle nest hatches, they all run to the sea at once, and even though seagulls are coming and picking them off, at least a few make it because they all release at once. Same idea with the corals. Also, picking a moonless night where there is no moon means that it's extra dark, and it's going to be harder for the fish and other predators to see these bundles of egg and sperm in the water to eat them. Coral scientists who study like the development of coral larvae, they have one opportunity per year to collect larvae, and so they have to be there at exactly the right time on the reef, scuba diving over the coral with their bag ready to collect the egg and sperm at the exact moment that it releases the egg and sperm. Fortunately, the corals are predictable, and scientists all over the world who study corals do this, and it's sort of like their whole year centers around this one super duper important night, whereas it's the only night of the year that they'll be able to collect their samples. Okay, so let's hope that these eggs and sperm found each other in the waters, and fertilization occurred, and development of the fertilized egg into a Planula larvae has occurred. Now this larvae, which has been floating around and maybe feeding in the plankton, it's ready to settle to the bottom and metamorphose into a polyp. It's got to find the perfect spot. This is not a decision to be taken lightly, because once this polyp sticks itself down to the bottom and begins to create a hard attachment, it can't change its mind. It's stuck there for better or worse for the rest of its life. So it needs a spot where it's not where there's some sunlight, right? It needs a hard substrate, and it needs to be in a place where it's not immediately going to be overgrown by something else like a seaweed or a sponge. And so even though these things don't have brains, they have some sensory abilities that can help them pick up on cues to where the ideal spot to settle might be. So there's some kind of things that if they smell that, they will not settle there. Like they don't want to settle next to fleshy or filamentous macroalgae, which are likely to overgrow them. They don't want to settle on soft mud, which will be a good place to attach. They like to settle on crustose coralline algae, this pink crust on the rocks. That is really like the ultimate place for coral larvae to settle on. It's hard and stable, and yet it won't overgrow them. So it's a perfect place to settle. And you can see that there was a coral polyp that settled here at the center of this young coral colony and has since expanded in every direction by budding into more polyps that are now creating this coral colony. Oftentimes in the early stages of colonial growth, there will be what they call an encrusting form, where the polyps kind of spread out like a drop of oil spreading out on the water, and they'll try to fill up as much space side to side as they can before, once they start to run out of space, that's when they might start growing up or creating branches and stuff. So kind of like the pattern of growth of the newly forming coral colony varies and adapts to the situation. Let's talk about this Darwin person again. Darwin, not only did he have interesting ideas about the geological history of atolls due to his observations of reefs, but he had some ecological insights into reefs as well. So it was clear to Darwin that the tropical waters he was sailing over were low in productivity. The waters were very clear because they didn't have a lot of algae. Darwin understood that the microscopic algae, the phytoplankton, were the basis for the marine food chain, which would lead to zooplankton and small fish and larger fish. And he was seeing these areas where there were tons of fish and corals and sponges and all kind of rich life in coral reefs, despite the surrounding waters being very barren with hardly any algae or plankton or nutrients or anything. And so it was kind of a paradox, right? Like, how can you have some of the most lush and productive environments in the world in waters that are so devoid of nutrients for primary productivity and devoid of plankton and other nutrition? And so other scientists in the decades since Darwin have addressed this paradox, and we think we've kind of got it figured out now. One of our observations is that the primary productivity of coral reefs is very high. Gross primary productivity is very high, comparable with the most productive environments on Earth, like rainforests, kelp beds, prairies, rich grasslands. The most productive places in the world are on par with coral reefs. Coral reefs are super productive. But that's gross primary production. So that's the overall amount of primary production. If you factor in the amount of primary production that is sort of eaten and broken down in that environment, it's very closely matched to the amount of primary production that's produced. So the net primary production, like the overall excess of organic matter that's produced, is like zero in a reef environment. Whereas some other environment like a forest or a kelp bed is producing all this excess organic matter, and the kelp is breaking away and washing up on shore, and there's extra leaves being produced in the forest that are piling up on the forest floor, and there's this excess production of organic matter because the net primary production is very high. High enough to actually, maybe even be exported into other ecosystems. But in a coral reef ecosystem, there's really no excess. Everything that's being produced on the reef is also being used on the reef. It's like a very efficient recycling system. So there's this intense productivity, but then all of these ravenous mouths and efficient food capturers that exist on the reef are eating up everything that's produced on the reef and recycling it back into nutrients that fuel productivity on the reef. So the productivity on the reef is not based on any like outside source of nutrients or food so much as it's based on just this very efficient recycling and reuse of the materials within the reef environment. And we think that the incredible diversity of reef organisms is what allows them to not miss a single scrap of food availability and to very efficiently recycle all of the materials and manage to be productive despite having little or no outside input of nutrients to the reef. I hope that makes sense. So what are some of these organisms that are doing the primary production on reefs? We know that zooxanthellae inside the corals are one of the primary producers on reefs, so we should definitely count that, even though it's not on this slide. But in addition to the zooxanthellae that live within the coral polyps, there are other primary producers on reefs as well. There are some seaweeds, which we call macroalgae. But they don't look very much like the seaweeds that we would find in a typical higher nutrient environment like a kelp bed. A lot of the seaweeds on coral reefs are calcareous seaweeds. They have calcium carbonate in them to sort of give them structural stability and defend them from grazers. And the most crusty and unappetizing of these seaweeds would be the Coraline Red Algae, the sort of the cement of the reef. So here's more of that pink stuff, which is the Coraline Red Algae, the sort of the cement that keeps the reef together. There are also some calcareous green algae, like algae in the genus Halimeda. Sometimes people call it watercress algae. It looks like all these little lobes of green that are fused together, and they're sort of crunchy and crusty. When it dies, it turns into this white calcium carbonate flakes that sort of contribute to the sediments of the reef environment. Then there are some algae on reefs that are more like typical seaweeds. And so the algae on reefs that are more like typical seaweeds, we call them fleshy macroalgae because they're rubbery and fleshy like flesh. Now a healthy reef doesn't have much of this typical seaweed on it. But an unhealthy reef can have massive amounts of fleshy macroalgae on it. And that's kind of a harbinger of doom for a reef. Like if it's getting covered in algae, it means that that reef is dying. Something is out of balance there. And typically it's an excess of nutrients. So if there's nutrients coming into the water from human waste, from sewage or fertilizer-rich runoff, that could fuel an excess growth of algae. Also, if there is something out of whack with the grazers, with the algae eaters, that could mean that the algae are not being consumed the way they should, and that could also lead to the algae overgrowth. Or it could be a combination. Maybe there's too much nutrients coming in, which are causing the growth of algae, and there's not enough grazers to eat the algae, so it could be both. On a reef where there are a lot of grazers, the grazers eat all of the algae that's easy to eat. And so the algae that's left is usually like a very short mowed kind of algae that they call turf algae. So it's pecked short by grazers, but it grows back really fast. It's this thin filamentous algae that grows back fast. And it's nutritious for grazing fishes and invertebrates. And so there's some types of fishes like damselfishes that intentionally cultivate turf algae. So they'll clear out the other organisms from the reef, and they'll just kind of have a garden or like a lawn of turf algae that they defend, and they eat themselves, but they eat the turf algae themselves, but they don't let any other organisms get near it. So here's a picture of damselfish guarding his turf or her turf. So you can see these little tufts of algae here, and that's the food for this herbivorous damselfish who will viciously guard its turf. And you actually need to be careful about these damselfish because they will bite you and draw blood if you get near their algae turf. They'll get right up in your mask and peck at you. There are some less conspicuous algae on reefs, including various kinds of microscopic algae that live attached to the bottom or even in the bottom. So algae can't live deep underground because algae need light. And yet, because the calcium carbonate skeletons of corals are semi-transparent, if you break open a coral, underneath the living flesh of the coral, in the semi-transparent calcium carbonate skeleton of the coral, there you can sometimes see these green stains, which are what we call endolithic algae, which means inside rock algae, and they grow beneath the semi-transparent surface of the coral skeleton. So because the coral is semi-transparent, kind of like milky glass, enough light can get through the coral flesh and through the surface layer of the skeleton to actually support the growth of some algae within the coral. These endolithic algae, I don't really know if they have a positive or negative effect on the coral. It's not a species that I'm super familiar with, but they are there. They're part of the ecosystem. And then what you would be more likely to see would be epiphytic algae. Epiphytic means growing on top of something else. So epiphytic algae, like these filaments of cyanobacteria growing on top of this soft coral here, you'll especially see it on top of dead or dying organisms, because usually if like a coral is alive, it's going to have defense mechanisms that can keep epiphytes, algae from growing on it. But if it's sick or dying, then the algae can kind of overgrow it, and you'll see this sort of fluffy algae overgrowing dying things on the reef. Particularly if the reef is sick or polluted by excess nutrients, you'll start to see these tufts of fluffy algae overgrowing the organisms on the reef. So because many of these algae, the fleshy macroalgae and the fluffy epiphytes in particular, have the potential to overgrow and smother the reef-forming organisms like the corals, it's very important that we have grazers to eat away the algae, to keep them at bay. So they keep the existing corals from being smothered, and they also clear open spaces for the next generation of corals, the baby Planula, to settle and grow. And then a final benefit of the grazers, which is a little bit ironic, is that by eating the algae and turning it into nutrient-rich waste, they actually return nutrients to the reef, which grows more algae. And so it goes along with that Darwin's paradox idea that the productivity of the reef is based largely on recycling of nutrients that were already on the reef. This is a midnight parrotfish, this beautiful blue parrotfish that eats algae, and this is a long-spined sea urchin, Diadema ontolarum, which also eats algae. There are, in fact, a lot of different species on the reef that eat algae, so many different grazer species are important on the reef. There are fishes in the family Scaridae. The parrotfishes are herbivores. There's the family Acanthuridae, which includes surgeonfishes and tangs, like this blue tang here from the Caribbean. There's invertebrates like sea urchins, and other invertebrates like this type of snail called a cowrie, which also eats algae. And there's all these different grazers, and different grazers tend to eat different kinds of algae. We say that the grazers are not functionally equivalent. Some do one thing, like eat one type of algae, others do another thing, like eat another type of algae. And those functional differences among the grazers turn out to be very important, because there's so many different types of algae on the reef, and the algae has many different defenses against grazers, that if you didn't have a huge diversity of grazers, there would probably be some types of algae that were immune to the grazers that you had. So only by having lots and lots of different grazers, including some that are able to eat like the poisonous algae, only then can you be assured that you're going to really get rid of all the algae and keep the reef clean enough for the corals to grow and flourish. So the coral dominance of reefs is enabled by the grazers, and without the grazers, the reefs would be algae dominated instead of coral dominated. There are interesting relationships between the important grazers on the reefs and the things that eat those grazers. One of the things that eats something that doesn't seem very edible at all is the triggerfish. So the triggerfish, there's more than one type of triggerfish, but this is I think the queen triggerfish, which is found in the Caribbean and in the Atlantic. They love to eat urchins, even the long-spined sea urchins. They have their eyes really far back from their mouth, and that's one of the things that helps them bite into an urchin without getting stabbed in the eye. And they'll crush open urchins and eat them. So they don't like completely eliminate the urchins from the reef, but they kind of keep the urchins confined to their hiding places on the reef. If triggerfishes are overfished, Then the urchins, which used to be sort of like only nestled in the holes on the reef, will now kind of populate and cover over the whole reef, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because if the triggerfish have been overfished, it's possible that the parrotfish and surgeonfish have also been overfished. And so if you've lost those grazing fishes like the parrotfish and the surgeonfish, then you actually might want more sea urchins to make up for the lack of parrotfish and surgeonfish. And so we kind of had a situation like this in the Caribbean, and particularly in places like Jamaica in the 1970s, where there was a lot of overfishing of all types of fish. So there weren't many grazing fishes, but there weren't many trigger fishes either. And so there were a lot of sea urchins, and sea urchins kind of became the dominant grazer. And the sea urchins were sort of the one thing that was holding the reef's ecosystem together and keeping the algae at bay. What happened when we lost the sea urchins due to a disease was really bad. I'll talk about that later. But first I need to talk about some of the other things on reefs. So we talked about grazers. Now let's talk about things that eat coral. So these are things that actually eat coral meat. So in the upper left-hand picture, we've got crown of thorns starfish. Crown of thorns starfish are sometimes abbreviated COTS for crown of thorns starfish. They're not actually fish, obviously. They're invertebrates in the phylum Echinodermata, which means spiny skin. And obviously these crown of thorns starfish are very spiny, and they're predators. They sort of slurp along, they extrude their stomach from their mouth and sort of just literally dissolve the flesh off the corals, and they're ravenous. They'll strip a coral reef bare of all its living tissue, leaving only dead skeleton behind. And so they can be absolutely devastating for reefs. It's funny because the crown of thorns starfish they're a native species to the Indo-Pacific Ocean. It's not like they're an introduced species. And yet they've been having these outbreaks of them there that are bigger than anything we've ever observed in the past. And we think that there's a human influence on the overabundance of the crown of thorns starfish. There's actually this giant snail that eats crown of thorns starfish. This is my terrible, oh God, it's a terrible picture of a giant snail. But there's this giant snail that eats crown of thorns starfish. And the giant snail is harvested for its beautiful shell and for its meat. And because of the lack of these giant snails, that's thought to be allowing the crown of thorns starfish to become overly abundant. Another thing that's thought to be allowing the crown of thorns starfish to become overly abundant is nutrient pollution. Nutrient pollution is increasing the amount of phytoplankton in the water, and the larvae of the starfish, which live in the plankton, can eat those phytoplankton, and this means that there's more baby starfish that make it to adulthood, and so sort of like the recruitment of these crown of thorns starfish has increased due to the pollution of the water and an increase in plankton in the water. Anyways, crown of thorns starfish are sort of like the most famous and problematic coral-eating organism in the world, but they're not the only one. There are some small snails that eat corals. There are a variety of fishes that will peck at corals, like some puffer fishes will eat corals, some butterfly fishes will eat corals. So there are a lot of organisms that will sort of nip at the flesh of corals, but none as devastating as the crown of thorns starfish. Coral reefs are complicated. This is a long lecture because we're dealing with the complexities of coral reefs, and it might be a little bit overwhelming. One thing that I would like to get across is sort of how scientists deal with the complexity of coral reefs. How do you even study an environment that's just so incredibly diverse, you don't even know what you're looking at half the time when you're in a coral reef? How do you deal with that? Well, there's multiple ways that we deal with that. One way is to ignore it, basically like block out most of the diversity around you and just focus in on one particular species. So you can't study every species in the week. On the reef, you just pick your favorite one, the most interesting one, or the one that you think is most important for the reef, and you just study that thing. That works. That's doable. Another thing is Instead of studying each species individually, you can kind of group them into broader taxonomic groupings like genus, family, or order. So let's say we're not just studying like every individual species of fish on the reef, but we're studying like parrotfishes. So we're doing like an overall count of parrotfishes or something like that. And using those broader taxonomic groupings, we can start to make sense. Like we're studying the stony corals, we're studying the parrotfishes, we're studying the boring sponges. We can also order things by kind of like what they do. So not necessarily what they're related to or what family or genus they're in, but sort of what their role is. So one of the roles that we just talked about was grazers. So you could study, like survey the amount of grazers. Planktivores means things that eat plankton. So some types of fishes are planktivores, for example. Piscivores are fish eaters, bioeroders. So you can order the species by what they do and then kind of keep track of how many of the things are there that do different things, and that sort of gives you some insight into some of the overall processes on the reef. And that kind of brings us to the final thing, which is, one of the approaches to studying reefs is instead of like meticulously analyzing the details of each individual species' life, you focus on whole reef ecosystem processes, like what's the overall productivity of the reef, what's the overall accretion rate of the reef, rather than what's going on in the interactions of individual species. Some of those interactions of species on reefs that are really interesting and important take the form of competitive interactions. Reefs are contested real estate, right? So it's this area that's crowded with life. Many species are living in close proximity with each other, and they're often vying for the same resources. Like they need the same space to attach to, or they need the same plankton from the water. They need the same light to grow, so one's trying to shade out the other. There's all kinds of things that they might be competing for. These two fish here, these are both white grunts again. They're competing potentially for mates or for territory, and it's really obvious to see the competition if it's two fish fighting each other like this. But when you look at the sessile organisms on a reef, even though they're not moving or they're moving too slowly to see, you can still see signs of their competition. Like wherever you see two organisms coming into contact with each other, like this sponge that's kind of growing upward over the undersurface of this coral, you can see that kind of contested zone of competition there. If you looked up closely at these two corals in contact with each other here, you can see that there's kind of a trench warfare zone where they're touching each other. And when two organisms that don't like each other are touching each other, they might fight in different ways. These slow motion battles can be fought with mucus. Mucus that has nasty chemicals or just is sticky and gross. They can fight each other with that. They can fight each other with their stinging cells, so one coral stinging the other, and the stings actually hurt other corals, so that's an effective way to fight. They can even do this thing where they sort of barf out their stomach onto the other neighboring coral with these filaments of the stomach called mesenterial filaments, and they'll sort of digest away the flesh of their neighbor to compete. So they've evolved these really savage ways of fighting against each other, even though they can't move. What determines the outcome of these battles is interesting too. Sometimes shading another coral or another species out is a way to gain an edge, but in this particular competitive interaction, the one that we see along this competitive zone here, the thing that's growing up from the bottom is a sponge. So sponges, some of them have symbiotic algae, but a lot of them just are filter feeders, and so they might not need the light. So the sponge might have the advantage in the darker area on the underside of the coral, whereas the coral might have an advantage where in the brighter area where it's getting sunlight. So different factors like light availability might tip the competitive balance for one species or the other. Another way that organisms fight is with what we call allelopathic chemicals. Allelopathy means like hurting another, so chemicals that you produce strictly to kill and compete with your neighboring organisms would be allelopathic chemicals. So not every time two organisms come into contact on a reef is competition, but many times it is. And so I ask my class when I give this lecture live about each of these 5 situations here and ask them to determine whether it's competition or not. First competition is like 2 polyps on the same coral head, which means that they're part of the same coral colony. They're fused, their flesh is fused, but they're still 2 separate. Well, there's 2 mouths connected to the same organism. Are they in competition? And usually the students recognize that no. 2 polyps next to each other on the same coral head, which are fused together and part of the same colonial organism, are they're not in competition. What benefits if one mouth gets some food, that will sort of transfer through the body into the other polyp, and it's all good. They're sharing the same resources. No competition. Let's say that coral is fragmented, but the 2 fragments grow and eventually they come back into contact with each other. Would that be competition? Actually, no, because the 2 fragments, if were originally part of the same organism, they're genetically identical, and they have means of recognizing that they've come back into contact with, their own body, basically, that they've been separated from. It's kind of like your arm popped off, and then 20 years later you find that had grown into another person, and you'd grown another arm, but you recognize that that's your sibling there, who's your clone, and you can fuse back together. Wouldn't that be great? Well, corals can do that, and so there's no competition in that case when 2 fragments that were originally the same individual are separated but then come back together. No competition. It's all good. If it's 2 corals of the same species, but they're slightly genetically different because they were each formed from a different egg and sperm and grew with a slightly different set of genes, those come into contact and there is competition. They may be the same species, but they're not genetically the same individual, and so they are unlikely to fuse with each other. They recognize that it's not a genetically identical clone that they've come into contact with, and so that will be competition. 2 corals of different species, competition again. They have no interest in helping the other one. They both want that space. And then coral and macroalgae come into competition. One's a seaweed, the other's a coral, but both are competing for space and light, so yeah, they would be in competition there. So if there's all this competition going on in coral reefs, some people might wonder, why doesn't one species take over? I mean, isn't there some winner that just wins and eventually the coral reef is just covered in that one species of coral or the one sponge or seaweed or whatever is the best? Why doesn't that just take over? So there have been different theories put forth to explain why you don't have this competitive exclusion happening on reefs. And one of the theories is the circular networks hypothesis, which is very similar to the game of rock, paper, scissors, where there's sort of 3 competitors and each one wins in certain conditions and loses in other conditions, or has a tie in other conditions. And there's no one species that wins all the time. So macroalgae might be able to win against coral, but maybe sponge could win against macroalgae, but then coral could win against sponge. And that sort of keeps any one species from permanently dominating and taking over the territory, because there's no species that can't eventually be displaced by something else. And so the cast of species is kind of constantly in flux. Also, if you add in the fact that the environment is somewhat variable, that can also contribute to the lack of unconditional dominance, because there might be some species that dominate under one conditions, like this is the species that dominates in the really shallow waters where the waves are breaking, but under somewhat other conditions, like where there's not so much wave energy, maybe there's some more delicate species that's able to grow faster and dominate. Within the reef environment, there's a range of conditions, and so there might be some species that dominate in some parts of the reef, but there's no one species that dominates in the whole reef. So species on a reef can compete, but they could also help each other. And when there is sort of a cooperative interaction between organisms on the reef, they call that a positive interaction or mutualism, because there's a mutual benefit to both organisms. So one of the types of mutualisms that's common on a reef are cleaning mutualisms, where one of the organisms is a cleaner, like a small fish or shrimp, that pecks dead skin and parasites off of a larger organism, which will visit its cleaning station, and the larger organism politely doesn't eat the smaller organism. And so there's been a lot of interesting study about how these relationships evolve. How does it work out that the big fish doesn't cheat and eat the small fish after it gets cleaned? What sort of maintains the stability of those relationships? And that's actually kind of interest to humans as well, because we're interested in figuring out how we can have stable societies where one group doesn't take advantage of another and things like that, and figuring out how nature has worked out these stable cooperative relationships might even help humans figure out how to cooperate better with each other without screwing each other over. All right. Perhaps besides the zooxanthellae coral relationship, one of the most famous mutualisms on the reef is the clownfish anemone relationship. Clownfish are this type of damselfish that is found in the Indo-Pacific Ocean. There's actually a number of species of them, and they're famous for living within the tentacles of anemones that would sting and maybe even eat other types of fish. And so living among the tentacles of the anemone gives these fish some defense. They're not going to be attacked by other fish because the other fish don't want to get in there and get stung by the anemone. So the anemone obviously gets something from this, the fish obviously gets defense from this relationship, but does the anemone get anything? Yes, it does. We've actually done experiments, not me personally, but other marine biologists have done experiments where they grew anemones with clownfish and without clownfish, and they found that the anemones with clownfish grew faster because the clownfish produces wastes, and the wastes fertilize the zooxanthellae that are living in the tissues of the anemone, and that allows the anemone to be more productive and grow faster. So kind of like the nutrients that are brought in by the clownfish help the anemone grow faster. So the anemone doesn't have thoughts or feelings, but if it did, it wouldn't mind that it had clownfish living in it. Another really cool mutualistic relationship between Cnidarians on the reef, in this case corals, and mobile organisms, the reef, in this case crabs, is the relationship between these crabs in the genus Trapezia, which live inside branching corals, and the branching corals. So these crabs are also called coral guard crabs because they guard the coral from predators that might eat the coral, even the vicious crown of thorn starfish like you see in this picture here. And so the little crabs, if they sense one of these predatory starfish coming to eat their coral, they will get right out there and pinch the heck out of that crown of thorn starfish, and if enough of the coral guard crabs come out and pinch the starfish, they can actually chase it off. So sometimes there will be like a whole reef where all the coral have been eaten by the plague of these starfish, but there's like one coral still surviving because it's the one that was well defended by guard crabs. A funny thing about predation on reefs is a lot of the organisms on reefs are sessile invertebrates. So they're animals that kind of look more like plants because they don't move and they have kind of an amorphous shape. And an interesting thing about a lot of sessile invertebrates is they can get partially eaten but not totally die. Kind of like a tree, a giraffe can take a few bites of the tree, but the tree doesn't totally die. Whereas, a shark takes a few bites of a fish and that fish is done for. In fact, the fish probably gets entirely devoured by the shark. The ability of these sessile organisms to be partially eaten but then kind of regrow helps keep them alive. And the fact that these predators are eating up and nipping away at some of these sessile invertebrates, sponges particularly, helps keep them from taking over the reef. So it can be really a good thing. So in the picture here, you see a hawksbill sea turtle eating a sponge on the reef. And hawksbill sea turtles love to eat sponges. That's like one of their main foods. And as long as there's a lot of hawksbill sea turtles, the sponges don't get very big and overgrow the corals. Another thing on the reef that he likes to eat sponges is angelfish. I'm not showing a picture of an angelfish, but they're these beautiful disc-shaped fishes that swim around the reef gracefully, and they eat sponges as well. So you need to make sure you've got enough hawksbill sea turtles and angelfish on your reef. Otherwise, the reef may be overgrown with sponges. And in fact, some reefs where the sea turtles have been hunted and the angelfish have been overfished, the reef is overgrown with sponges and there's not very many corals left. So it's a similar concept to what can happen if there's not enough grazers to eat the algae on the reefs, and the reefs get overrun with the algae. It's just instead of algae overgrowing the corals, it's sponges overgrowing the corals. So again, this top-down control by the grazers or the sponge-eating predators is very important for maintaining the balance of organisms on the reef. I've got a bunch of videos that I linked here of some cool predators on the reefs that you might want to check out as well. In addition to these predators that eat sessile invertebrates, there are active predators as well that eat little fish and shrimps and other things on the reef. And some of them are really creepy and weird, like the mantis shrimp, the bobbert worm, and giant Nemertean worms. So there's definitely some creepy predators on the reef that are worth checking out. There's something that I wanted to say in relation to the idea of sponges being partially eaten and that keeping them from overgrowing the reef. And that's about organisms' life histories. And so I just wanted to kind of contrast the life history of a solitary organism, like one that just has its body and it's not fused to clones, versus a clonal organism which grows in a colony of like many polyps. The life and death are kind of different if you're a solitary organism versus if you're part of a colony. So let's present what you're familiar with first. This is the life history for a non-clonal organism, like a human or a crab or a fish. You start out, egg and sperm meet and create a fertilized egg called a zygote that develops into a larvae or like an embryo, which eventually, if it's a person, it's born. If it's a fish, it's like laid and hatched, and then that baby or juvenile grows until it becomes an adult, in which case it can reproduce, make eggs and sperm that create the next generation. And it's just this simple sort of like you start out as a fertilized egg, and you grow bigger until you're big enough to reproduce, and then you die. But of course, you could die at any stage in life. You could die at the larval stage, you could die as a baby, you could die as a child, you could die as an adult. You always do die as an adult, even if you make it through the other stages. So that's life if you're a solitary organism. Now, if you're a clonal organism, part of a colony, you've got all the same possibilities of either, you could grow bigger and get to the next stage, or you could die, but you've also got some other possibilities. And so let's look at the life history possibilities if you are a clonal organism that grows in a colony, like a coral or a sponge or bryozoan, something else that grows as a bunch of fused zooids. As you grow, you could shrink. That's one of the possibilities. Like your colony could just not grow, or you could stay the same. Your colony could split into a bunch of small parts, and so you'd go from being big to being small. That's something you would never see in a solitary organism like a human. Like, you're not going to see a human like their head fall off and their arms fall off and each becomes a baby. That would be strange, but that doesn't happen. And yet for corals and sponges, that does happen for these clonal organisms. So you could have this fragmentation, which we call fission, or a coming back together of the fragments, like a bunch of small bits come back together into a big colony. That would be called fusion. So a bunch of little bits that were once the same organism come back into contact, and bloop, they fuse. And so there's all those different things that can happen. And then, of course, death can still happen too. It's just there's a whole variety of things besides just growing and dying and reproducing that can happen if you're a clonal organism. And fusion and fission and partial mortality are some of the same ones. Like if this was the big adult coral here and a lot of it got eaten or died, then it would end up being smaller, but it could regrow back to a large size again, or it could be eaten and diseased some more and get even smaller still. So you can go backwards and all this kind of stuff. It's very cool. Something that's not very cool is disease on reefs. We didn't really even realize that corals could get sick until the 1970s. Coral scientists all of a sudden started seeing coral diseases cropping up all over the world. Not just one coral disease, but a whole variety of coral diseases. And it took a long time for us to figure out even what was causing most of the diseases. We didn't even know what bacteria or virus or protozoa or fungus was even causing some of these diseases. We just knew what the sick corals looked like, and then they eventually died. And we're still kind of in that situation. There's a lot of coral diseases where we still don't even know exactly what organism causes the disease. We just know that what the sick corals look like and that they eventually die. One coral disease where we do know the causative agent is aspergillosis. It's caused by a mold called Aspergillus, which is in the same genus as a soil fungus that lives on land. But scientists who have studied this have found that it's related to the mold that lives on land, but it's not actually being introduced from dust from land. The original hypothesis was, the mold spores that are killing this coral are being blown over in the dust from Africa, but we found out it's not the same type of mold as can be found in African soils. So it's just another fungus that's killing corals. Anyways, the question that we've often had about these diseases is, why now, or why since the 70s? And it wasn't like just in the 70s corals got sick. It was in the 70s we started to see corals getting sick, and since then it's just been like new diseases cropping up all the time, one disease after another. And we think that it's because of pollution, climate change, and other environmental stresses. So the corals are getting stressed by changes in the environment wrought by humans, and that stress is weakening them and making them more susceptible to diseases that didn't used to kill them before. So some of these diseases may be caused not just by one type of germ, but by a couple of different types of microbes that kind of form this evil alliance and together cause a lot of harm to corals. Black band disease is one of them. You can see this black band on the coral that separates the recently dead tissue from the still alive tissue. And if you look at like a time lapse, you can see that this black band of death is proceeding across the coral and has mostly killed the coral after a couple of weeks. And then this part here there's like algae growing on top of the dead skeleton of the coral. So this, even though it's brown, it's not coral anymore. It's just a rock covered in algae. And unfortunately, lots of reefs, particularly in the Caribbean, are now just rocks covered in algae because the living coral that made those rocks has perished due to disease and other factors. And now all that's left are the algae covered rocks. White band disease was a particularly devastating coral disease that afflicted the Caribbean. It was caused by an unknown pathogen. I think we do now know the pathogen that causes
white band disease, but I'll have to check up on that. It killed the two species in the genus Acropora in the Caribbean, and this was a real tragedy because prior to the disease, these were some of the most abundant corals in the Caribbean, and they provide a ton of structure to the reef because they're big branching corals that provide lots of hiding places and that slow down the water currents and create great breakwaters. So they were just these really, really structurally important corals on the reef that are basically just gone now. We've lost over 90% of the Acropora corals from the Caribbean, and so the reef structure is just not the same as it was. These great branching forests have now just crumbled into nothingness, and there are some surviving corals in the Caribbean, but there's just not these great branching forests that there used to be. Another tragic disease that hit the Caribbean and caused a lot of problems was a disease that actually didn't affect the corals directly, but it affected the long-spined sea urchins, Diadema antillarum. So I mentioned when we were talking about coral grazers that Diadema were an algae-eating grazer that could be important, and they're especially important in areas where the other algae-eating grazers like parrotfish and surgeonfish had been depleted by overharvesting. So where the other algae-eating grazers are gone, the sea urchins are became super duper abundant and super duper important. But maybe because they were so abundant and overpopulated, diseases were transmitted relatively easily among them. And so this new disease came along and almost completely wiped out all of the long-spined sea urchins in the Caribbean in just a matter of weeks. It just ripped through the Caribbean like a forest fire. And you know, there were a few long-spined sea urchins that survived, but the vast majority were gone. And reefs went from having a lot of coral and sea urchins to having no sea urchins and tons of seaweed, especially if there were no other grazers there left to eat the seaweed. One of the problems with restoring a coral reef after it's lost a lot of its coral is Allele effects. We've talked about Allele effects, or we'll talk about Allele effects a few other times here, so I'm not going to go into a super detailed explanation of what they are. But Allele effects are these things that make it hard for populations to grow if they get reduced to a low level. And you can kind of picture that if you imagine like looking down on a coral reef from high above, and all these blue dots are supposed to be colonies of coral. And so for this species of coral, there's like lots of colonies of it, and they're relatively closely spaced. So when it comes time to spawn, all these corals are going to be producing eggs and sperm, and the eggs and sperm are likely to be fertilized, and the next generation will be assured. If most of these corals die and there's only a few isolated ones left, they may be producing eggs and sperm, but those eggs and sperm are not going to have much chance of finding each other, and so it's unlikely that there will be any successful reproduction. So even if these survivors keep surviving, they're unlikely to be able to repopulate the environment. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, besides preventing corals from dying in the first place, which is the most important thing, is where corals have been reduced to a low abundance, we're trying to sort of give nature a boost, and we'll like take little cuttings from corals, take them back into the lab, and break them up into a bunch of little pieces, and then go plant those little pieces of cultured coral back out on the reef to try to sort of create these growing colonies of coral that they can repopulate the reef. So coral restoration, whether it will ultimately be successful or not, is a major effort in many parts of the world where corals have been reduced to low abundance. And the hope is that it will be able to sort of give coral reefs another chance, even though we've killed a lot of their corals. I have to say, though, that things look bad for coral reefs. If you look at the long-term trends, particularly for the Caribbean, they're just devastating. Percent coral cover, which is one of the main ways we measure how much of a reef is covered with coral that's actually alive, it's gone from sort of like 50+% when we first started monitoring in the 70s down to less than 10% now. And if you extrapolated this line to 2020, it unfortunately would be even lower for the Caribbean. So it's just this like really obvious, devastating, total loss of coral cover. It's just, I can't overstate how awful this is. Basically, we were going from having tons of live coral in the Caribbean just in the late 20th century to having hardly any live coral left now. And so we still have the physical structures like the limestone that was made from the corals that were there generations ago. But if you look at it, it's just rock covered in seaweed now. There's hardly any live coral on it. And that means that that rock is not being formed, and it's just crumbling away to nothing. So unless we can reverse this trend, we're really in huge trouble in the Caribbean, and we may just not have reefs there anymore after a while. And so there's sort of like four big factors that are leading to coral decline in the Caribbean and worldwide. Acidification and climate change are big problems. The warming climate creates a stressful environment where the water's too hot for the delicate symbiotic relationship between the corals and the zooxanthellae. That leads to bleaching and leads to disease. Acidification makes it harder for corals to grow as the water's more acidic. They can't lay down their calcium carbonate skeleton. Their larvae may be less likely to survive as well. Eutrophication and sedimentation. Eutrophication, remember, it rhymes with nutrification. It's where there's an excess of nutrients in the water that cause an overgrowth of algae that can cause clouds of phytoplankton that make the water too murky for the corals. It can cause fast-growing algae to smother over the corals. Sedimentation is where dirt and silt are washed in from like construction sites on the land. That can smother over the coral because the corals, when they get covered with dirt, they have a hard time getting the dirt and silt off of themselves. They have to create a lot of mucus and then slide the mucus layer off themselves, and that requires tons of energy, which will exhaust the coral's energy reserves if they're constantly having to slough the mucus off. So so if there's a lot of dirt and silt being brought in to the reef environment, that can kill it through sedimentation. Overfishing can be devastating to the reef. So obviously, if you're directly harvesting the coral, that's really bad. But even harvesting the other organisms that live around the coral can be bad because of their chain reactions through the food chain that indirectly benefit the coral. Particularly if you're over harvesting the algae-eating fishes, you're making the coral vulnerable to being overgrown with algae. If you're over-harvesting the sponge-eating sea turtles and sponge-eating fishes, that can allow the coral to be overgrown with sponges. So overfishing is really bad for the reefs. And then physical disturbance like being blown up by dynamite or dredging, or having islands built on top of you to make military bases, which is something that's happened in the South China Sea. Those things can devastate coral reefs. Because all of these impacts on coral reefs that I was talking about are caused by humans, an increase in the abundance of humans on the landscape in the areas around where coral reefs live is increasing all of these negative impacts on coral reefs. And that's really worrisome in the state that we're in, or that I'm in right now, Florida, because there's already a large number of people in Florida, but the projection for 50 years from now, in the year 2070, is that will about double the current population of Florida, which is incredible, because there's so many people living here already. So much of the land is already occupied with homes and farms and things like that, and it's creating so much pollution that having twice the number of people here would just be an almost unimaginable amount of pollution running off into the waters surrounding Florida, and almost surely wiping out the coral reefs that live around the southern part of our state. So This is not inevitable, but if we don't want this sort of overpopulation disaster trend to happen, we need to do something different than just continuing the trends that we've been doing so far. So I was sort of talking about Florida and the Caribbean and problems in the reefs there. There are problems facing reefs all around the world. So the same threats that I mentioned for the Caribbean, climate change, pollution, overfishing, physical disturbance, those threats are facing reefs in the Indo-Pacific as well. The Great Barrier Reef, one of the largest and historically healthiest reefs in the world, is well protected from some types of disturbance, but it's still dying out. And these data from a report that you can access at the link below show some of the coral cover and the trends in coral cover for different parts of the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is doing better than the Caribbean, but there's still a lot of areas where coral cover is low, coral cover is declining, and where they're suffering from coral bleaching events related to unnaturally warm waters, or coral die-offs due to crown of thorn starfish outbreaks. So you can look at those data if you want to pause the slide or look at the report. Finally, if you're still interested in more information on coral reefs, two great resources, preeminent world-renowned scientists who've studied coral reefs from different perspectives over time are Dr. Nancy Knowlton and Dr. Jeremy Jackson, known affectionately as Dr. Doom and Dr. Gloom respectively, unless I reversed their names. They've both been sort of great advocates for conserving reefs, and also sort of strident complainers about the threats facing coral reefs, and saying, we can't just pretend everything's going to be okay with coral reefs. We really need to do something different if we want coral reefs to survive even a little bit longer. So take a look at that, and thank you for watching my talk. All right.